Hi class, welcome to week 3. I hope that you're enjoying the course so far, that you're getting a lot out of the assignments, the reading, the translations, and the exegetical notebooks, as well as the discussions and the feedback that myself and the TA are giving you. I want to take the next few minutes and wrap up week 2 and then briefly introduce week 3. So in week 2, this past week, you translated, as part of your exegetical notebook, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, the beginning of the book, uh, the introductory poem, and I haven't had a chance to go through the exegetical notebooks, but I look forward to giving you detailed feedback on them over the course of the next few days. But I do want to highlight a few things that you encountered in that. One is just the title Kohelet, which, as you hopefully have noticed, is a feminine singular participle. It's a title, it's not a name. And it follows a familiar construction in which feminine singular participles are used as titles. And this often happened, I should say, pretty regularly in the post-exilic period. And it comes from the root kahal, which means to gather or assemble. And we also find the kahal with two comets, meaning the post-exilic cultic community, or the cultic community in the post-exilic period. And we find this term in Ezra 2:64, Ezra 10:8, and Nehemiah 7:66. I encourage you to take a look at those passages and see how that term is used. And so here we have the title of this individual, Kohelet, one who gathers or one who assembles, perhaps the leader of a kind of religious community, or maybe it refers to him as a gatherer of wisdom, which we kind of see stipulated or suggested at the very end of the book. So keep that in mind as kind of, this is who this person is. This is who Kohelet is. You came across, of course, the term Hevel, which is variously translated enigma, vanity, meaninglessness, and there's a multitude of different translations. Ask a different translator and you'll get a different translation and explanation of the word. Now we'll discuss this in more detail later. In fact, next week I have a video on translating Hevel, and you'll actually do a word study on this word as well. But in order to properly understand this term, we need to consider a few things. One is its etymology. Now, etymology does not determine meaning, but is informative for understanding the meaning of a word. We need to understand the usage of the word outside of Ecclesiastes. We need to understand comparative Semitics and how cognates in, let's say, Aramaic or other Semitic languages might shed light on the use of this term. But ultimately, the use is determined by the meaning and its context, so in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I hope that just your engagement with your dialogue partners and the secondary reading and your attempts at translation so far has encouraged you to hold your translations and your interpretations tentative, particularly this early in the course. And one thing I also want to impress upon you is that sometimes there is no effective translation in the receptor language. That is, some terms, even like shalom, which is variously often translated peace, or welfare or health, may not have a fully translatable meaning in another language. There just may simply not be a word that covers the same semantic range, and so you may have to translate each use of the word contextually, and so the number of times that Hevel is used in Ecclesiastes may not have one singular meaning. Another issue you came across is chapter 1, verse 3, a rhetorical question. It's often referred to as a rhetorical question. As I mentioned before, I don't think it necessarily is. In fact, Bartholomew, even though he calls it a rhetorical question, he calls it the programmatic question. And he argues that it invites the reader into dialogue with Kohelet. And I would ask you to just consider, how does the question, or how does a question at the beginning of the book frame a book for its readers? think of it in terms of also kind of speech act theory, right? So you have the locution, what is said, uh, what is the profit uh, of the toil for one who toils under the sun? And then there's the illocution, what is meant. So, it could be different. It could be, if somebody's sitting around and saying, man, I wish I had a cup of water. The locution is a statement expressing the wish for a cup of water. The illocution, what is meant, could be that hidden underneath of that could be a question about or a question to somebody. Hey, could you get me a cup of water? And then there's the perlocution. What does that statement then do? It's perlocutionarily effective, or has perlocutionary effect if a statement gets somebody to do something. And so think about that in terms of this question. What is the locution? What is said? That's just the basic, simple task of translation. Then there's the illocution. What is meant? What does Kohelet or the text mean by this question? And then the perlocution. What does it do to you? What is the effect on you as the reader? And then also, think about how the poem itself frames the book. How does it set the stage for understanding or relating or dialoguing with the book? You also came across that singular Shen relative article on Sheya'amol, which he toils in verse 3. You're going to come across this relative article very frequently in the book. You came across terms like under the sun and toil and things like that, which are going to be words that we continue to go back to. They're going to be words that Kohelet continues to use throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. In terms of the poem itself, I want to maybe suggest that one of the goals of this poem is to remind the reader or bring to the fore for the reader the constant movement of life with no real progress or goal. The poem talks about the lack of advantage or benefit in that question, the circularity of life, the lack of fulfillment, the lack of novelty, the lack of remembrance. And in terms of the circularity of life, he talks about generations that come and go. He talks about the wind, the sun, rivers that never fill the sea. And so somehow this frames and shapes our reading of the book. And I want you to ask, how does it do so? You also came across a little bit of authorship, and Bartholomew talks about this as well. We'll get into more of this in week 3. And then in your secondary reading, which was about translation and the difficulties of translating the book of Ecclesiastes, that article shaped the discussion for this week. And one of the common themes that was expressed in the discussions was humility in translation, understanding that there is a loss in translation. Translators make interpretive decisions, they fill in gaps, they smooth over things for the benefit of the readers in the receptor language. And so think about that as you even translate these texts yourself. How are you smoothing over difficulties in the text? How are you filling in gaps? Where are you placing or emphasizing, kind of an interpretation in one part of your translation, but maybe not emphasizing it in another part of your translation? And I would kind of wrap up this discussion of week 2 by just impressing upon you the need for intellectual humility. And I would ask that even especially this early in the course, leave your conclusions at the door, so to speak. Many of us have very strong backgrounds in Bible or theology or whatever the case is, but I ask you to study the book inductively. Try to find out what the book itself is, the points the book itself is raising, the issues the book itself is raising, instead of impressing upon it our own kind of theological constructions, particularly at this point. And if you leave your conclusions at the door at this point, you might be surprised where you come to at the end of the course. Now let me introduce week 3. In week 3, you're going to translate 2 non-contiguous sections of the book. You'll translate chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, and then you'll jump to chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. And I really want you to use those dialogue partners, Bartholomew and Holmstedt's commentaries, as you work through the Hebrew. Your comparative and secondary readings are going to explore the traditions about Solomon and Solomonic authorship. which is a question we've raised so far but haven't kind of dug into extensively. You'll also look at, in videos, look at the meaning of Hevel as well as the phrase under the sun. And then I hope you enjoy the reception history stuff that you'll get into in week 3. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for listening to this introduction, wrap up an introduction of This Week and the Next. And I hope that you, again, are enjoying the course. If there's any questions, please contact me, and I look forward to dialoguing with you throughout this week. Thanks.